During World War II, Gordon Hirabayashi, along with 120,000 other people of Japanese descent on the American West Coast, was subject to Executive Order 9066, in which anyone of Japanese descent on the West Coast was to obey a curfew and then later to be forcefully removed from their communities and placed in an internment camp. Now, Gordon Hirabayashi refused first the curfew and then refused to be sent to the internment camp. Obviously, shortly thereafter, he was convicted for his actions. However, he was not satisfied simply with being convicted. He turned himself into the FBI so that after the conviction, he could appeal the court's decision all the way to the Supreme Court. Now, the Supreme Court did not rule in his favor during that court case, Hirabayashi versus United States. However, he did, through many legal battles, protests, and other forms of challenges throughout his life, he was able to later get that decision overturned sometime in the 80s. Now, with this sort of persistence throughout his life to continue this fight even after World War II and after the internment camps had already been stopped, those actions are predicated on a few ideas that he continually demonstrated throughout his life and are subject of my speech here today. So the first of those beliefs is that Gordon Hirabayashi believed that it is an individual's responsibility as a citizen to be an agent of action for the change he wishes to see in the world. Next is the idea that he believed the Constitution should be used to protect all citizens always, even during times of armed conflict. And then, an idea on a more fundamental level, he greatly exemplified principles of respect for all kinds of people, and believed that those principles should also be placed and instilled inside the U.S. federal government. So moving on to the first of those ideas that I discussed, he believed that it is an individual's responsibility to be an agent of action for societal change one wants to see made. So he disagreed with the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. So he refused to be interned himself and instead turned himself into the FBI so that he could take his disagreements all the way to the Supreme Court. He is quoted by NPR as saying, "I consider it my duty to maintain the democratic standards for which this nation lives. Therefore, I must refuse this order of evacuation." So what he's saying there is that he saw a change that needed to be made, and that is that Japanese American citizens' rights should not be taken away simply because an executive order has been made so that national security could be upheld. He's saying that it is his duty to maintain the democratic standards for which this nation lives. He's saying that this is not a democratic, that the executive order is bypassing the democratic system and that we should change that. And by him appealing all the way to the Supreme Court, he's being the agent of action for that change. Now, that next idea that I just talked about, he says he believes the Constitution should be used to protect all citizens always, even when wartime circumstances might suggest otherwise. In an interview, Gordon's nephew explained his uncle's vigorous adherence to this belief. And he says, Gordon went to American public schools and was fully exposed to the Bill of Rights and the principles of the U.S. Constitution. So at that level, he felt that both curfew and mass incarceration were unconstitutional in nature. Gordon describes this fuller in an article by the University of Washington College of Arts and Sciences. He's quoted as saying, "I'm not going to allow my citizenship to be usurped without my protest. I'm going to stand up for my rights. I also want the cloud removed from over the heads of 120,000 others. My citizenship didn't protect me one bit. Our Constitution was reduced to a scrap of papers." Now, the reason the government was reducing the Constitution to a scrap of papers was this Executive Order 9066. And Gordon's nephew, who studies this actual situation of internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, his nephew Lane Hirabayashi is studying this at the University of Washington, and he says that what the courts did in this particular case was focus on just the curfew issue, and that they upheld the need of the president and of the government to impose curfew as needed, whenever needed, to protect the interests of national security. And Gordon felt that that was not a constitutionally sound decision, as it prevented the Constitution from protecting all American citizens. Now this leads me into my next idea, which is that Gordon brought into government principles of respect for all kinds of people, regardless of race or beliefs or religion or sexual orientation. Now, by Gordon challenging the notion that basic rights given to each citizen by the Constitution, that those rights could be ignored during times of war, Gordon challenged that idea. And by doing so, Hirabayashi played a part in tightening future federal adherence to the United States Constitution. So in conclusion, Gordon made significant personal sacrifices to exemplify his core values and the ideas that I've discussed in this speech, being that one should be the agent of action for the change one wants to see made, and also that the Constitution should be followed, especially during times of war, and that it should be used to protect all citizens always, and that principles of respect for all kinds of people are needed inside our government. So he made continual sacrifices throughout his life to exemplify those ideas and get them into government. And the sacrifices that he made paid off, and that his ideas have made a lasting impact on government. Me, as a high school student, I've seen that in textbooks, failures of the U.S. government to adhere to the Constitution, such as internment of Japanese Americans or McCarthyism, those events have a very negative connotation in our textbooks. We frown upon those situations. And that largely comes from repeated appeals by people during the 20th century, such as Hirabayashi, in which over 4 decades he appealed the constitutional violations and eventually had them overturned. Those challenges represent the ideas that I've talked about in today's speech, and that by continually reinforcing those ideas, he has made a lasting impact on government, in which there's a principle of respect for all kinds of people, and that people are aware that they can be the agent of action for the changes they want to see made in the world. And those ideas are what Hirabayashi continually enforced throughout his life and have made the largest lasting impact. Thank you.